Hello guys, welcome back to Not Just Make. It's Marco here, and today it's finally time for the first video of the NJM Paint Club. It's been officially 1 year since my first video on YouTube. One incredible year, full of important milestones, satisfactions and great achievements. And this is all because of you guys. Thank you so much for your support and the constant flow of inspiration and ideas that this virtual back and forth between us generates every single week. My dream to make the YouTube channel and its branches the center of an inspired community of modelers and painters is becoming a reality, and this is the best part of the job. Since the beginning of this adventure on YouTube, my Patreon community has grown constantly, and it has been the key of my freedom to spend so much time making videos and sharing my way of painting, and this particular video couldn't have a better timing. The idea of a virtual community project was there since the beginning, but recently it became a proper need. Thanks to your help and feedback, the loose concept of painting something together has evolved into the NJM Paint Club, and I really hope this will become a tradition of our little creative family and a fun way to grow as a group. Plus, I started paint clubs in every city I've lived, and this is probably the natural evolution of my passion to share my passion. The rules are super simple. Every month we choose together a model or a small set of models that can fit into most people's budget, taste and hobby time. We choose all together a general style with public polls. True metal, non-metal, clean weather, maybe even color schemes and crazy challenges. All the patrons with access to the Facebook page get the raw, unedited footage of me painting the models, while on YouTube I publish the standard edited version like all my other videos. I want this experience to be open and inclusive, so everyone can join, and who wants to see every single little microscopic brushstroke can find the extra footage on Patreon.
For the first turn of the Paint Club, the community chose with a public poll the 3 models of the Wurmspat from the GW Warhammer Underworlds line. And with the second poll, the community decided the tools and techniques I can use and the general style of this paint job.
So let's move to the real work because this is a long video, and again, if you want to see its monster version of more than 6 hours, you can find it on Patreon. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification button.
These push-fit kits are meant to be easy to build, and in general they really are, especially if you want to build them without glue, for a quick game straight from the box. But sometimes it's difficult to obtain a perfect match and a good seal between the two parts. Here is a juicy trick directly from the Gunpla world. If you cut diagonally the female end of the joint, you drastically reduce the friction between the two plastic elements, maintaining at the same time a good amount of contact area for the glue. The bond will be equally strong and the parts will perfectly fit together. Here again, 2 high friction parts that can create a huge gap if not well pressed together. I always test fit the parts before adding the glue, and with this trick it's easy to take them apart. It's better to use a good amount of plastic glue, so the excess of glue and melted plastic can perfectly seal the 2 parts, making them a solid block, without seam lines and super easy to clean and refine. A quick coat of black primer. This is the first turn of the Paint Club, and I want to paint loosely following the box art and using simple, effective methods based on the materials and techniques that are my signature. Mostly inks and oils, so you can see also the real-time application of my favorite tricks. Plus, this is not a speed painting video, but I still want to keep the work in the time of a paint session with friends. After all, this is a Paint Club. I usually use pure white ink to paint the value sketch, but I admit that can be challenging to use if you are a beginner with inks or if you need a softer and smoother transparency, so these days I'm testing my own perfected white ink. I add 1 part of glaze medium and 1 part of matte varnish to 4 parts of ink. Glaze medium adds a bit of body and a lot of transparency, and the matte varnish makes its finish perfectly opaque, making it a better first layer without unwanted shiny glares. The recipe is still a work in progress, but it's something worth trying. I call it zenithal light, but as always I choose a more dramatic and theatrical angle. It's a 45-degree angle, probably less, focused on the direction in which the models are looking, for a simple but effective focus in the core of the model. This is almost always the best choice for gaming models. I have a lot of space to regulate the intensity of my white, and I can easily create a solid progressive grayscale from almost black to white. The plan is to play with transparencies, painting only midtones and shadows on top of the sketch, so it's better to keep the highest light extremely light. I use a simple basic flash hue as a midtone for my skins. It's very light and is applied in transparency over white, so it will not add a lot of life and health, keeping the tone more similar to an off-white. It will be enough to sustain the next stages that will give the skin its real character. The second main tone is the green of the armors. I want to loosely follow the box art, but I want more a greenish bronze than a proper green armor. I use sap green and raw sienna inks to recreate the desaturate yellowish green, and then I add a fluid silver to make it a metallic paint. Wait, better than metallic paint, because as you can see here, it's still maintaining its high transparency thanks to its base made with inks. This tone will easily show in transparency the value differences of the sketch. I mix a dark bluish metal using turquoise and black ink and silver. Doesn't really matter if you use these mixes with brush or airbrush, they still maintain the same properties. Here I use the green metallic mix with the brush to paint a part that I missed in the first step. The result is exactly the same. I can even increase the transparency of the mix simply adding a bit of water. It will create a layer that can interact even better with the sketch underneath, adding a lot of volume and visual interest with a single, quick, flat coat of paint. With the same logic, I prepare the ingredients to mix a couple of extra metallic tones. A white pearl effect using white ink and silver for the helmet. I want the mask to look like mother of pearl or some kind of shiny organic material. And a simple warm yellowish bronze using yellow and silver. I call these recipes metallic contrast paints, and I want the royalties when GW will copy this idea. I want to add a reddish tone here and there on the pieces of fabric and feculous cape, but this is NURGLE and I want more realistic nuances, so I add green to magenta. It's complementary on the color wheel to desaturate its bright tone. As always, color theory is everything. Matte varnish is there only to kill the shine of the inks. Here I want to paint fabric and to create a contrast with the metal part, so I need a solid matte finish. A matte finish is mandatory to create the illusion of common fabric, and varnishes with a different finish are an essential tool to have on your workbench. Not to protect your models, because it's just another layer of paint, but to change their finish when needed. I really love to see different realistic sensations on the model. A full matte finish is very good for pictures, but reality even in miniatures has much more nuances, and I love to show these when people see my models in person. Again, doesn't matter if you have an airbrush or not. Here I apply the same mix with the brush, building its tone with a couple of layers. And again in the airbrush to paint the crest of the helmet. The only thing I consider when choosing one tool or another is the time I need to paint an area. In this case it's faster using the airbrush, while for the little pieces of fabric was quicker to use a couple of brushstrokes. I use burnt umber ink to paint leather and wood. Again, I use the ink transparency to let the volumes of the underpainting visible through this layer, and I use its main weakness to my own advantage. Every tool has its own strengths and weaknesses and its specific use, but if you know well your materials, you can work around them and with them. Inks and contrast paints, that are the same stuff, are extremely good at tinting and marking a surface with their first contact, leaving immediately unwanted marks and stains. For these reasons, they are a bad choice if you need to paint a perfect uniform smooth layer with a brush, but are a great choice if you want to create an uneven, dirty, stained surface like the leather skirt of an NURGLE witch. I also try to boost this behavior using a stippling motion that creates drops and extra stains. And I apply a second layer of diluted burnt umber only to add extra movement and texture. The extra transparency will keep the value as it is, adding only the texture effect. I use a mix of Vallejo Game Color turquoise and gloss black to paint the black elements like hair and bags. Here I'm playing again with the finishes of these parts to make them look greasy and sweaty. Now all the base tones are in place, with already a subtle value modulation and sensation of volumes. All the tones are still very light because I need the virtual space to add a lot of extra shadows in the next step that will bring extra tones and will give to all the volumes much more contrast and presence. I start with burnt umber straight from the bottle. This transparent brown tone will fuse perfectly with the warm decayed tones I have already in place, enhancing their putrid warmth. It works well over skins, armors and fabric, adding a first level of coherency to the separate elements. Then I move to deep violet. Still a warm tone, but with a cold sensation inside. I add this tone inside the previous shadows, exactly like a classic layering. It makes everything darker for the overlapping of tones that gain opacity with every new layer, and by contrast with the previous warmer tones. I close the progression with turquoise. Using this cold hue, I close the movement from the warm yellowish tones of the lights and midtones to cold shadows. It will not be really perceivable because it will optically mix with violet, becoming almost black, but the cold sensation is there, creating a vibrant and interesting contrast with the other parts. These few steps added a lot of complexity to a fairly simple base, and with oils I'll continue pushing on these, but in a smaller and more controllable scale. These days I'm testing Uptailung oil paints. They are specifically made for figures and weathering, and they should dry a bit faster than Artis oils. To be honest, I didn't notice any meaningful difference, but they are still nice, smooth paints with a lot of useful, ready-to-use specific tones, especially for weathering, and this is pretty handy. I use a palette coherent with the tones I have already in place, with black, burnt umber, magenta, and a light flesh tone. You don't want to add too many new colors at this point, but you want to reinforce what you already have. I mix black and burnt umber with white spirit in a fluid but consistent mix. I want this mix to have some body, to create not only definition but to add also a real thin layer of grime that I can manipulate on the model. This is not a general wash because I don't want too much randomness in this paint job. It's controlled to avoid losing the tones I have in place that I really like, but not too much, so it can still be real dirt moving here and there. You have to find a balance depending on the area, and if it's plausible to have extra grime in there. Okay, these are Nurgle warriors and probably there is grime everywhere, but I still want to maintain a certain level of plausibility. Then I mix magenta with the previous recipe, making it darker and more desaturated. This time the mix is very diluted and transparent, because I want to use it as a filter, not as a wash. A filter is meant to slightly alter the tone without creating pools or collecting into the recesses like a wash, and it has to be more diluted and transparent and applied in a more uniform way. I use the hairdryer to speed up the evaporation of white spirit. This is really all you need before moving to the next step, because the real quantity of paint added to the model is microscopic and the thinner was its main volume. Ooh, and remember to use only cold air in this stage. I can immediately move to the cleaning step. I use Q-tips and a pointy brush to clean the excess of my wash. I use immediately white spirit where I want a cleaner finish, so the thinner can easily take off all the extra paint, while I use a clean Q-tip in the other parts, so it will clean with less strength and create a simple, subtle blend of the tone with the rest of the surface. These will create two different finishes, with sharp lines and less general impact on the armors, and smoother blended tones in the other parts. I add also an extra highlight here on this huge belly, using the light skin tone. It's very easy to make this step with oils, making it look like painted with an airbrush. I simply apply the paint on the model, and with the flat brush I blend it with all the rest. The opacity will be at its maximum in the spots where I apply the initial line or dots, and it will fade all around. Visually, the result is the same of a fine glaze or an airbrush spray, but much easier to control in this kind of small application and much quicker. I don't want too much random weathering on these models, but I love to paint splatter effects. I use light mud, extremely diluted, to project on the model real splatters of paint. The beauty to do this with oils is that you can easily clean the dots you don't like or that miss the target. And I move immediately to the wet palette. All the thinner is gone, and again, the amount of oil paint on the model is minimal, so I don't need to wait or seal anything. Prepare a cup of coffee, go to the bathroom, or put the models a couple of minutes under an hairdryer. This is already enough to be able to move to the next step. On the palette, I have light desaturated tones like white, buff, black, Naples yellow, yellow ochre, light skin, magenta, purple, and moss green. I'm here to paint textures, adding definition and highlights, so I can start directly with these light tones. I spent on this step the same amount of time I spent on all the rest of the work, but here any progress appears with a slower pace. I mix a progression of tones for the purple fabric. I use again green to lower the saturation and vibrancy of the original hues. When you mix complementary colors, you move the mix into a colored grayscale that opens a whole new realm of tones. I use these colors to paint light midtones and extreme highlights. Since I'm starting from dark midtones, I can incorporate a lot of interesting textures at this point that will naturally blend in the space between the base and extreme highlights. I use different solid brush strokes, dots and lines to create the texture of a thick fabric and a lot of cuts and imperfections. The tip of the brush does most of the work with short strokes and quick movements. Then I mix a series of yellowish white tones to paint all the bones and skulls and the white elements. Again, the objective is to add definition and a lot of visual interest. You don't want to paint only the edges, but a variety of extra details and interesting little elements. If you paint only the edges and the outer borders, you'll obtain a simple comic feel without any real depth. Here is my palette for wood and leather. I opted for extremely desaturated tones, almost real grays, to paint the sensation of the natural discoloration of this kind of materials. For the skins I need only few extremely light tones. I still have the original white in some of the highest parts, and all the previous steps created the modulation to almost black. The idea is to add little sharp details and very extreme highlights to complement what I already have. A big part of the final work is the light definition on the metal parts. I use scale 75 trash metal to do the job, and this is one of the rare cases where I use a metallic paint on the wet palette. I want it quite fluid and diluted to be used not only for panel lining, but also to add microscopic cuts, dot and subtle highlights inside the flat parts. So in this case I don't mind if it takes some extra water from the palette, and since it's a long work I can really use a pool of paint that doesn't dry quickly. I define edges and rivets, but the real fun part is to add little details inside the flat panels of armors and weapons. As I said at the beginning, I don't want too much randomness in this paint job, and I want to be in full control of weathering and damages. That's why this part is so important. It can seem a long job, but when the end starts working it's pure fun. And here is the final result of this first meeting of the NJM Paint Club. I'm really curious to see how you use these ideas and techniques in your models, and how you'll adapt these methods in your own workflow and style. I really hope that the real-time video will be useful to understand better certain steps and their nuances. It's difficult to deliver on YouTube this amount of information in a single time, especially for all the brush work at the end, so the long version can really be the way to solve your doubts. These techniques are so under my skin that sometimes I can't really tell which are the parts and steps that can be difficult for you, so tell me in the comments if you need a focus on something in particular, and obviously check the huge video on Patreon.
If you like this video, give it a like and subscribe. Remember that you can always ask me anything down below with a comment, and you can follow my projects during the week using one of my socials. And if you want to support the channel and my work, check my Patreon page and join the community, or maybe ask for a commission. See you next week, guys!